You were never supposed to know about Clearwater. Not the mansion, not the man who built it, and certainly not the bloodline that began there. Every record that could speak was burned. Every witness who whispered disappeared. But history has a way of bleeding through the cracks. And tonight, I'm going to show you what crawled out of George's soil in the summer of 1852. Picture this. A moonless night, the kind where the air itself feels afraid to move. The fields are silent except for the sound of something being dragged across wet earth. Heavy, deliberate. Inside the main house, every candle has been extinguished except one. Behind a locked door on the second floor, a man writes by that single light. His name is Edmund Rodold. Planter, politician, widower. And what he's writing isn't a will or a confession. It's an instruction, a manifesto of blood. In that journal, hidden beneath a false drawer, he records what he calls the continuation protocol, to preserve the Rodold name beyond death. To build a dynasty immune to the decay of ordinary families, but what he planned would turn human beings into instruments. Flesh into legacy. You see, Edmund believed power should not just be inherited. It should be engineered. He had studied the new sciences of heredity, the whispers coming out of Europe about blood and breeding. What farmers did to horses, he believed men could do to bloodlines, but to achieve that he needed control. Total control. That summer, he dismissed half his servants, closed the plantation gates, told the county his daughters were ill. For 11 months, no one saw them. The shutters stayed drawn, the fields went quiet, only smoke rose from the chimneys, and the faint sound of a piano at night. They said he was grieving his wife, that he'd gone reclusive, eccentric, a victim of melancholy. But those who worked the fields saw lights moving in the attic windows long past midnight. They heard crying, muffled, rhythmic, always followed by the sound of the overseer's boots. And when the new sheriff arrived the following year, he found what no lawman should ever find. Not a crime of passion, a crime of design. This isn't a ghost story, friend. It's a lesson in how power, once it tastes its own reflection, starts breeding with itself. Power doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it whispers through philosophy, dressed in reason, draped in sophistication. That's how Edmund Rodold hid his madness. He called it continuity. A noble pursuit, he said. A science of refinement. He wrote that the blood of a family was like soil. It could be strengthened or polluted, cultivated or left to rot. He would not let his lineage decay through marriage, weakness, or the dilution of fortune. He would improve it, refine it, breed it. When he returned from Atlanta that spring, he was no longer just a planter. He was a man infected by an idea, the belief that legacy could be constructed. He spoke less, smiled less, and spent nights pacing the library, reading European journals on heredity and animal husbandry. His daughters saw it in his eyes. That distance that means a man has crossed into obsession. Catherine wrote in her diary that her father studies the laws of creation as if he intends to rewrite them. He began classifying everyone around him, not by name, but by use. His daughters became components of lineage. His enslaved workers became subjects of selection. He ranked them, weighed their traits, spoke of them like breeds. But behind the veneer of science was something darker, a hunger to defy death itself. He wrote, "Man dies, but the pattern may live, if the pattern is perfected." To him, women were vessels of that perfection, and his own daughters, the most pure and malleable bloodlines, under his control. You see, he believed nature had cheated him by taking his wife before she could give him a son. So he would take nature back. By force, by calculation, by sin. He sought counsel from a judge, a doctor, and a preacher. 3 men of authority. Each one he bound with favor or debt. Each one he used to wrap his crime in legitimacy. The judge to bend the law. The doctor to falsify the records. The preacher to whisper moral justifications from the pulpit. And through these men, Edmund built a system, not just of silence, but of approval. He convinced them it was progress, destiny, divine order. They called it selective providence. By the time his plan was complete, it wasn't just his house that was locked. It was his conscience. And when he turned the key that sealed his daughter's fate, Georgia itself held its breath. The first door closed on June 12, 1852. No one outside the house knew it then, but that was the night Clearwater stopped being a home and became a laboratory. Edmund dismissed the household staff at sunset, telling them his daughters were unwell, that they were not to be disturbed until further notice. He sealed the second floor with iron locks, installed by the blacksmith under the pretense of security improvements. But what he was securing wasn't against intruders, it was against escape. Inside, the air turned stale with fear. Catherine, the eldest, tried to reason with him. She begged him to explain, to tell them why the doors were locked, why they couldn't write letters, why their rooms were stripped of mirrors and clocks. Edmund spoke softly, always softly, as if speaking to frightened children. "You are chosen," he told them. "You are to preserve our name." He framed it as destiny, not punishment, as service to something greater than themselves. The daughters didn't yet understand what that meant, but they felt the shift in their father's voice. That subtle tremor of someone no longer speaking to people, but to instruments. Over the next week, he dictated their routines. Meals brought to their rooms. No communication with the staff. No time outdoors. The doctor visited, under the guise of monitoring their health. He examined them in silence, refusing to meet their eyes. When Catherine tried to ask him what was happening, he only said, "Your father believes he's saving you." Downstairs, Edmund met nightly with Judge Ketchum and Dr. Strickland, whispering through cigar smoke about lineage, purity, and the mechanics of breeding. They charted names, bloodlines, cycles, reducing life to arithmetic. To them, it wasn't perversion, it was controlled creation. A man playing God in the image of progress. Samuel, the enslaved man Edmund had chosen, was brought to the main house one night, without explanation. He was told he would earn his freedom. He was told it was an experiment sanctioned by law. He didn't understand until it was too late. After that night, the piano upstairs fell silent. The servants whispered that the master had gone mad, but no one dared leave. No one dared speak. Clearwater had become a sealed world, where sin wore the mask of science, and blood became both altar and currency. Samuel knew something was wrong the moment they took his tools away. For 12 years he had worked the land, trusted with irrigation, planting, the rhythms of the earth itself. But now, his days were spent waiting for orders that came after dark, delivered by the overseer with no explanation. He slept in a small shed near the main house, guarded, isolated. They told him the master had plans for him, plans that would earn him freedom. But freedom in Clearwater had become a word without meaning. When he was brought to the upper floor that first night, he saw the fear in Catherine's eyes and understood. Not the details, not the full horror, but enough to know that the promise of liberty was a lie wrapped around something unspeakable. He did not resist. Resistance meant death. But inside, something ancient hardened. A quiet defiance that no chain could reach. Afterwards, Edmund summoned him to the study. The master poured 2 glasses of whiskey, as if they were equals. "You've done your duty," he said calmly, "and you'll continue to do so until this legacy is complete." Samuel said nothing. He stared at the map on the wall. The outline of the plantation, every acre marked with precision. It looked less like property and more like a prison blueprint. Edmund followed his gaze and smiled faintly. "Every line represents order," he said. "Without order, there is only decay." From that night, Samuel began to memorize everything. Every locked door, every entry in the master's journal, every whisper between the judge and the doctor. He cleaned the study under supervision but learned where the false drawer was hidden. He saw the papers, diagrams, notes on lineage, dates. He didn't understand the words, but he understood their meanings. The children would not belong to their mothers or to him. They would belong to Edmund forever. In the fields, the workers noticed Samuel's silence. He no longer sang as he worked. He no longer spoke at all. One woman said his eyes had changed, like he'd seen God, and God was something terrible. That summer, storms swept through Hancock County. Lightning split the sky, setting fire to a storage barn. The locals called it judgment, but at Clearwater, judgment was already inside. And with each strike of thunder, Samuel made a silent vow that he would leave behind a record the master could never erase. By late July, Clearwater had turned into a living mausoleum, the walls breathing with secrets, the floors carrying echoes that refused to die. Samuel no longer prayed. He no longer hoped for rescue. What he did instead was far more dangerous. He began to remember every word, every date, every night that Edmund's boots climbed the staircase. He trapped it all in the cage of his mind. Memory became his rebellion. It started with chalk marks under the floorboards of the servants' corridor. Faint symbols only he could read, a triangle for each night the daughters were taken upstairs. A line for every new whisper of life, forming within that cursed house. He couldn't write in full sentences. The overseers checked for papers, but his code grew complex. Patterns, tally marks, geometry of pain. Then, one night, as the rain beat against the shutters, he found something. The master had dropped a small brass key, cold and heavy as guilt. It didn't fit the study or the cellar, but it turned smoothly in the lock of the attic door. Inside, he found what Edmund had been hiding even from the judge and the doctor. Charts, bloodline sketches, and a single phrase scrawled across the top of the largest parchment. The future belongs to those who control inheritance. It wasn't just madness. It was manifesto. Samuel knew if he were caught in that attic, he'd die before sunrise, so he memorized everything. The symbols, the calculations, even the strange Latin inscriptions Edmund used to dress his sin in sanctity. He closed the door silently and returned to his quarters. That night, for the first time in months, he prayed, not for himself, but that the truth would one day be spoken. When the doctor returned days later, Samuel watched him closely. Strickland's hands trembled as he performed his duties. The man was decaying from the inside, conscience eating him alive. Samuel saw the same sickness spreading through the judge, too. Ketchum no longer looked Edmund in the eye. Power was rotting its own architects. And through it all, Edmund wrote more feverishly. God creates, he wrote, but man refines. Downstairs, Samuel whispered into the dark, no, master, man corrupts. He began planning how to pass his record, not on paper, but in living memory, in story, in blood. It began with a story, just a whisper at first. A tale Samuel told the younger field hands, while they worked under the sun. He spoke of a house where God's light no longer entered, where a man had tried to rewrite creation, and where the earth itself refused to bury the truth. He didn't name Clearwater. He didn't have to. Every worker on that land felt the weight of that story pressing against their chests each night. In the South, stories were more than words. They were camouflage. Under the guise of superstition, truth could move freely. Samuel wove symbols into the folklore, each detail a fragment of record. The iron gates became the ribs of the serpent. The daughters were the 3 lilies in the tower. The master was the one who fed his blood to the soil. Those who listened closely understood. Those who didn't simply thought it a ghost story. Either way, it spread. By mid-August, even the overseers whispered about strange happenings. Footsteps in empty hallways, cries at midnight, candles relighting themselves after being snuffed out. Fear began to erode obedience, and Edmund felt it. He could sense the cracks forming in the silence he'd built. So he tightened control. No gatherings after dark. No singing in the fields. Anyone caught whispering superstition was whipped. But superstition was already stronger than fear. Because it carried fragments of truth, Samuel continued his secret recordings. Sometimes he scratched marks into the backs of wooden beams in the smokehouse. Sometimes he taught the children songs filled with coded phrases. The lilies in the tower can see the moon, they sang, in the serpent sleeps beneath. It was ritual now, a rebellion of memory. Meanwhile, Catherine had stopped eating. Her diary entries, if they still existed, were filled with disjointed prayers. Pleas to her dead mother. Margaret had begun to hate God. Elizabeth, the youngest, was silent. The doctor recorded illness due to confinement, but his trembling hand betrayed him. Even he began to believe the land was cursed. Edmund didn't see it that way. He believed the suffering was proof of progress, that purification required pain. The blood must learn obedience, he told the judge one night. But as summer faded, something else began to stir. Not rebellion, but reversal. The house was no longer obeying him. The silence he had built began to whisper back. By September, Clearwater had begun to breathe in strange rhythms. The walls creaked at night like something alive, the windows fogged from within even when no candles burned. The servants whispered that the house was rejecting its master, that it remembered every cry, every lie, every drop of blood that had seeped into its foundations. The air felt different, heavy, observant. Edmund ignored the unease. He told himself the noises were just wood and weather, the chill just a sign of the season changing. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. His daughters avoided his eyes. Their silence no longer submission, but quiet revolt. Even the doctor's reports had turned clinical to the point of mockery. Detached notes about maternal complications that read like confessions disguised as data. One morning, Edmund entered the nursery that had been prepared for the heirs. The cradle stood waiting, hand-carved mahogany, lined with silk. He stood over it for a long time, tracing its edge. For the first time in months, his hands trembled. The thought flickered. What if the blood does not obey? He pushed it away, telling himself he was creating perfection, but fear had already taken root in him. Outside, Samuel watched from the fields. The overseer had vanished 2 weeks earlier, rode out at dawn and never returned. Some said he'd gone north. Others swore the swamp had swallowed him. The truth didn't matter. Without the overseer, the plantation's discipline faltered. Men worked slower. Women prayed louder. Something unseen was building. That night, a storm rose, sudden, violent, biblical. Lightning struck the bell tower, splitting the iron frame. Edmund took it as an omen. He locked himself in the study, clutching his journal like scripture. The pages were filled with equations, sketches, phrases written over and over. Purity is continuity. Continuity is dominion. But the ink had begun to blur, the letters bleeding into each other, as if even the paper refused to hold them. Upstairs, Catherine screamed, not a cry of pain, something deeper, like a warning from the part of the soul that still recognizes evil when it wears its father's face. In the fields, Samuel looked toward the house. Thunder rolled like judgment. And for the first time he smiled. He knew the house had turned, and when a house remembers, it does not forgive. The storm didn't sound like thunder anymore. It sounded like tearing, like heaven itself was trying to rip open the roof of Clearwater and drag out what had been hiding beneath it. The first strike hit the north chimney, sending bricks crashing through the parlor. The second set fire to the stables. By the time the third hit, even the slaves in the fields had dropped to their knees, whispering prayers they hadn't said in years. Inside, Edmund ran from room to room, sealing shutters, shouting orders no one followed. The doctor had fled into the storm hours earlier, soaked and half-mad, babbling that the children weren't human. The judge never returned from his last visit. His carriage was found overturned near the creek, the driver gone, the horses drowned. Clearwater had begun erasing its witnesses. On the second floor, the daughters huddled together in silence. Catherine clutched the crucifix her mother had given her, its silver bent from years of handling. Margaret whispered that the storm was punishment. Elizabeth, her voice barely a breath, said, "No. It's awakening." They felt the vibration through the floorboards. The pulse of something old, deeper than weather, deeper than fear. Samuel broke into the house that night. He didn't care about freedom anymore. Freedom was meaningless if truth died with him. He carried a lantern and a spade, his shirt plastered to his skin. Lightning lit the hallway as he climbed the stairs, and in that flash, he saw the portraits of Edmund's ancestors staring down, eyes blackened by soot and shadow. He found the girls in the locked parlor. He broke the latch with the spade. For a second, none of them spoke. Only the storm did, roaring like the voice of judgment itself. Then Catherine whispered, "You came back." He nodded once. "It's time." Below them, Edmund screamed, not in pain, in fury. He had found his journal destroyed, pages scattered and soaked. The ink blood into the floorboards, the words dissolving into meaningless stains. Everything he had built, his science, his order, his dynasty, dissolving before his eyes. Samuel turned to the daughters. "If you want to live, you follow me now." Outside, the storm split the oak tree in front of the house. The same tree where generations of slaves had been whipped into obedience. And as it fell, Clearwater's reign began to end. The hallway was alive. Every door Samuel passed seemed to breathe, the wood pulsing under his fingertips like it had veins. The air was thick with heat and rain, and the smell of burning oak. He led the daughters down the staircase, but halfway to the main floor, the house groaned. A long, drawn-out sound like a dying animal, and one of the steps splintered beneath his foot. He caught himself against the banister. The lightning outside flashed through the tall windows, and for a second, he saw something carved into the wall that had never been there before, a series of circles intersecting, spiraling inward. Catherine froze. "Those are his marks," she whispered. "No," Samuel said, "they're yours now." The ground shook. A portrait fell from the wall, Edmund's great-grandfather, the first Clearwater. The frame shattered, revealing another layer beneath the plaster. Samuel grabbed a shard of the broken frame and scraped away the wall until he hit something solid. It wasn't wood. It was stone, black, polished, etched with the same spirals. Beneath the spiral was a single Latin word, sanguinem. "Blood. Help me," he said. Together, they pulled at the loose boards until an opening appeared. Behind it was a narrow passage leading downward. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. Catherine hesitated. "He told us never to go there," she said. "That's why we have to," Samuel replied. They descended into the dark. The storm above seemed to fade as if the house itself was swallowing sound. At the bottom, they found the room. Stone walls, iron instruments, jars lined along the shelves, and in the center, a table bolted to the floor still stained. Catherine covered her mouth. Margaret turned away, but Samuel moved closer, eyes scanning the walls. He saw ledgers, dozens of them, each marked with dates, names, and something else, numbers beside each birth. "Experiments," he whispered. "He recorded every child born here." Then they heard footsteps above, slow, heavy, coming closer. Samuel blew out the lantern. The girls froze. The air trembled. Edmund's voice echoed down the corridor. Calm, controlled. "You think I built this house to die in, Samuel?" The lantern's last ember flickered out. And in the dark, the true inheritance of Clearwater began to stir. The voice came closer, steady, deliberate, the kind of calm that only comes from madness dressed in reason. Edmund descended the steps with a candle in one hand and a revolver in the other. The flame barely illuminated his face, but it caught his eyes, bright, wild, feverish. Behind him, the storm still howled, but down here, in the stone throat of Clearwater, there was only breath and heartbeat. "You were never meant to see this," Edmund said softly, his tone almost paternal. "This is sacred work. You mistake progress for sin, Samuel. You mistake salvation for cruelty." Samuel stepped forward, the girls huddled behind him. "You call this salvation? You called it inheritance while you broke everything good in this world." Edmund smiled. "Broken things make the strongest vessels." He raised the candle, lighting the walls around them, revealing shelves lined with vials, bones, and jars of what looked like blood preserved in amber. "This is the future," he whispered. "Lineage perfected, flesh purified. I have done what God refused to do. I have corrected his imbalance." Catherine's voice trembled. "You killed Mother for this." The smile vanished. For a moment, something human flashed across Edmund's face. Guilt, or perhaps memory. But it died quickly. "Your mother was weak," he said. "She wanted mercy in a world that rewards only will." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Then you've mistaken will for worth." He stepped closer. "And now the house is correcting you." As if on cue, the stone beneath them shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling. The candle flame wavered. Edmund looked around, confusion cutting through his arrogance. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Samuel said. "You fed this land your blood for too long. It's full." The shelves rattled. One of the jars fell, shattering. The fluid inside hissed as it touched the floor, bubbling like acid. Edmund staggered backward, revolver shaking. The candle fell, fire licking across the stone in thin lines. Following the spirals etched into the floor. Catherine screamed. Margaret grabbed her hand. Samuel lunged forward, knocking the revolver from Edmund's grip. It clattered across the room. Edmund shouted something. A prayer or a curse. But the sound was swallowed by the rising roar beneath them. The house wasn't collapsing, it was awakening. The chamber began to tremble. Not like a collapse, but like something exhaling after centuries of restraint. The spirals carved into the stone glowed faintly red, pulsing in time with the storm outside. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to sync with it. Samuel felt the vibration through his chest, a low hum that grew into a deep, resonant moan, the sound of the house remembering what it was built upon. Edmund stumbled backward, shouting above the noise. "It's just the storm! Do you hear me? It's only thunder!" But the light beneath their feet was not lightning. It was rising from the floor itself, from the blood that had soaked these stones over generations. The air thickened, metallic, hot. The jars along the walls began to crack one by one, the liquid inside evaporating into a red mist that filled the air like breath. The smell was copper and rot. The spirals on the floor blood light, fluid, alive, tracing pathways that led straight to the center of the room. Catherine and her sisters clung to Samuel as he backed them toward the steps. "We need to move," he shouted, but the staircase was no longer visible. The walls had begun to shift, sealing them in. Edmund dropped to his knees, hands pressed against the glowing floor, eyes wide with awe. "Don't you see?" he whispered. "It's working, it's answering." His voice cracked. "I am the blood. I am the legacy. Same will reach for him." But the master looked up, smiling through tears, as the red light crawled up his arms like veins of fire. "You can't kill what has already become divine." The light surged. The shelves burst. The floor opened like a wound. For an instant, Samuel saw beneath it. Bones tangled in roots, skulls fused into the foundation itself. The entire plantation was built on bodies, each one part of the ritual Edmund had spent decades perfecting. Catherine screamed, and the sound shattered something. The red glow flickered, then dimmed. The spell faltering, the rhythm breaking. Samuel grabbed the girls and pulled them toward the side wall, slamming the spade into the stone again and again until a crack appeared. Air rushed through, cold, clean, living air. Behind them, Edmund laughed as the floor swallowed him whole.
Continuity!
He screamed. Continuity. Then the chamber caved in. They burst through the cracked wall into the night, just as the chamber imploded behind them. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was deeper, like the earth itself had sighed after holding its breath. For too long, the storm had reached its height. Rain came down in sheets, turning the fields into rivers. Every flash of lightning illuminated the house, no longer proud and symmetrical but warped, sagging, melting under its own history. Samuel led the daughters through the mud, half-dragging Margaret, who could barely stand. The smell of sulfur and smoke filled the air. "Don't look back," he said, but Catherine did, and saw the great windows of Clearwater, glowing red from within, as if the house itself were burning from the inside out. A scream rose from that light, not human, not earthly. It was a sound of centuries, of the enslaved, the forgotten, the silenced, the voice of the land itself, mourning and avenging in the same breath. They reached the edge of the field, where the great oak had fallen, split in two. Lightning still licked its branches. Samuel stopped, breathing hard, and looked back one final time. The roof collapsed inward. Flames roared out through the upper windows, sparks carried upward like lost souls. "It's over," Margaret whispered. Samuel shook his head. "Not over. Just free." He turned to the sisters. "You have to remember what happened here. Don't let anyone bury it again." Catherine nodded through tears. "They won't believe us." "They don't need to," Samuel said. "You'll make them remember anyway." In the distance, a rumble. Not thunder, but the slow cracking of stone as the cellar collapsed. The earth was reclaiming its debt. The plantation's perfect geometry, the fences, the fields, the white columns, all dissolving into mud. When dawn came, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of ash and iron. Where Clearwater had stood, there was only steam rising from a blackened crater. Samuel stood at its edge, with the three daughters beside him. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Catherine whispered, "What do we do now?" He looked toward the horizon, where the first light touched the fields. "You tell the story," he said, "and make sure no one calls it history. Call it a warning." Decades passed before anyone dared speak the name Clearwater again. The land was sold, resold, and eventually left to rot. A scar no one wanted to own. Locals avoided it, saying the soil was cursed, that crops withered overnight, that tools rusted within days. But it wasn't the ground they feared. It was the memory, the echo of what had been done beneath it. By the 1890s, the story had fractured into rumor. Some said the master had gone mad and burned his estate with his family inside. Others whispered that his daughters had made a pact with something ancient, trading purity for power. Every generation added its own superstition, its own version of the horror. But every version kept one detail the same: the sound. The scream that came from the burning house, said to echo through the trees whenever lightning struck the old field. In 1912, a group of university researchers from Atlanta came to document Southern legends of moral corruption. They were skeptics, men of science, but their report, now hidden in a private collection at Emory, told a different story. They described finding fragments of melted iron shaped like surgical tools, pages of a journal fused together by heat, and one word still legible on the surviving page: Bloodline. What they didn't publish were the testimonies of nearby farmers. One man told them that a woman had been seen wandering the ruins, decades after the fire, pale and silent, carrying a child wrapped in linen. The man claimed she disappeared whenever approached, leaving behind footprints in the ash that glowed faintly under the moon. Over time, Clearwater became a place boys dared each other to visit. A southern ghost story passed between generations. But the truth never fully died. It just hid, buried beneath layers of myth and denial. And in the silence of the forgotten plantation, something waited. Not a ghost, but an idea. The same idea that had poisoned Edmund Roteld's mind, that control could be perfected, that blood could be engineered, that human will could rewrite creation itself. Because corruption doesn't vanish when the guilty burn. It adapts, it reappears in new forms, in science, in politics, in systems that look nothing like chains yet serve the same masters. Comment below, the blood remembers. Twice. That's not just a phrase. It's a signal. It marks the moment you stop being a spectator and start becoming an observer. One who sees the patterns history tried to erase. The story didn't end in the ashes of Clearwater. It evolved, because corruption, when buried, doesn't decay. It seeds itself into the next generation's ambitions. By the early 20th century, the same theories that birthed Edmund Roteld's madness had resurfaced under a new banner: eugenics, no longer whispered in plantation studies or secret journals, but spoken aloud in universities, funded by governments, and praised as science. Georgia, 1917, the first Better Blood conferences began. The language was polished, sanitized. Words like improvement, heredity, and racial hygiene replaced the crude brutality of slavery, but the core remained the same: control the blood, control the future. Among the sponsors of those early conferences were descendants of families who once traded with the Ruteld line, men whose fortunes had been built on the backs of Clearwater's original sin. They called it progress. But every form signed, every sterilization performed, every child labeled unfit, all of it echoed that first act of engineered dominance. Edmund's belief had simply been given a laboratory and a government grant. The dynasty he imagined never truly died. It was absorbed into systems of policy, medicine, and law. By the 1930s, more than 30 U.S. states had eugenic sterilization laws. Entire families deemed genetically undesirable were erased quietly, legally, and behind many of these programs sat committees of wealthy Southern families. Names that, if you trace them far enough, lead back to plantations like Clearwater. The ideology had gone national, then global. It reached across the Atlantic, where it was studied and refined, until it reappeared in Europe under a darker banner that would define the century. But beneath the surface, the same ancient hunger pulsed, the desire to purify, to perfect, to own the future. The illusion of benevolence masked the same ancient cruelty: to breed obedience, to sculpt the human spirit through fear and inheritance. When modern historians trace this thread, they find gaps, missing documents, burned records, sealed archives. But if you follow the money, if you follow the lineages, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. It was never about race alone. It was about hierarchy, about who gets to decide what kind of human deserves to exist. And somewhere in that hierarchy, the Ruteld signature appears again. Faint, smudged, but still there. The blood remembers, the system endures. By the middle of the 20th century, the conversation had changed again. Or so it seemed. The talk of bloodlines, heredity, and breeding faded from the public stage, but only because it had been replaced with something more precise, more invisible: psychology. The same men who once charted the purity of blood now studied the architecture of the mind. They learned that domination didn't need chains, laws, or cages. It only needed belief. After the Second World War, a new era of behavioral science began. Universities that had once taught eugenics now taught conditioning. Research moved from breeding farms to laboratories, where rats and humans were both tested to see how far control could go before rebellion began. But behind the academic language, compliance, stimulus, social cohesion, was the same question Edmund Roteld had whispered to himself in his study. How do you make a man obey without realizing he's a slave? Funding poured in from unseen sources. Think tanks, foundations, government programs with names that sounded harmless. Social scientists began designing experiments not to understand humanity, but to engineer it. They mapped fear, tracked obedience, and cataloged the soul's breaking points. When television arrived, they saw their masterpiece, a device that could broadcast emotion directly into the domestic mind. It didn't demand submission, it invited it. The plantation had become the living room, the overseer, now a smiling host, and the whip, a flicker of light that carried suggestion, repetition, rhythm. By the 1960s, entire populations could be steered not by force but by narrative. History rewritten in real time, truth fractured into segments, attention harvested like cotton. Every ad, every broadcast, every official story was part of the new experiment, control through comfort. And while most believed they had escaped the past, the architects of that comfort sat quietly at the top. The same bloodlines, the same institutions, only with cleaner names. Foundations became families, research grants became inheritance. The symbols changed, but the intent remained: order through breeding, obedience through design. They no longer bred bodies, they bred belief. And when belief itself becomes a bloodline, rebellion turns into heresy. Now you begin to see the pattern. The plantation never vanished. It evolved into systems so sophisticated that even the enslaved think they are free. By the late 20th century, the plantation had become digital. Its fences invisible, its overseers silent. The masters no longer rode horses through fields. They sat in glass towers, watching numbers move across screens. But the essence hadn't changed. Control had simply found a new medium: data. The elites learned that the mind could be owned more efficiently than the body. Where Edmund Rodold once calculated bloodlines, modern institutions began calculating behavior. Every purchase, every vote, every search term became a strand in the new genealogy. A record of lineage, not of flesh, but of thought. Algorithms became the new genealogists, tracing patterns, predicting desires, shaping futures. Education molded the next generation to accept obedience as intelligence. Students learned to memorize rather than question, to conform rather than seek truth. Universities, once sanctuaries of inquiry, became factories of ideology, funded by the same families who'd once perfected improvement through breeding. Only now, the breeding was intellectual. They didn't want thinkers, they wanted repeaters. Reliable minds who'd serve the machine. Without ever seeing its architecture, the media carried the rhythm of the new overseer's whip: constant stimulation, constant distraction, constant division. Truth became a commodity, traded and twisted to fit the agenda of unseen hands. Every headline another chain, every controversy another tool of separation, because a divided population doesn't rebel, it consumes. Finance completed the system. Debt became the new chain, currency the leash. Just as the plantation thrived on ownership, the global economy thrives on your permanent dependency. You don't need to be locked in a field when you are locked in perpetual obligation. The overseer's voice now arrives through notifications, reminding you what you owe, what you need, what you lack. And through it all, the same ancient principle hums: beneath blood is destiny. Control the bloodline, or replace it. In the modern world, bloodlines aren't physical. They're corporate, institutional, ideological. The great families of control have merged into conglomerates that own not just land, but perception itself. Every click, every scroll, every thought recorded. A map of obedience. The plantation has no gates because it no longer needs them. You live within its design. The men who inherited Edmund Rodold's dream no longer seek immortality through children. They seek it through systems. Freedom, as you've been taught to imagine it, was never real. It was engineered, a psychological sedative to pacify the masses while the machinery of control restructured itself behind the curtain. The architects learned from centuries of rebellion. To prevent uprising, you must first convince the prisoner that he is free. That illusion is the masterpiece of the modern age. Every choice you believe you make, what to buy, what to believe, who to trust, was designed long before you touched it. Corporations manufacture preference, governments manufacture outrage, and the system manufactures identity. Free will became a marketplace product, packaged as empowerment, but built on manipulation. This is how they perfected obedience, by letting you choose your chains. You scroll, you click, you speak, and every action is interpreted as consent. The plantation no longer needs guards. The prisoners have learned to police each other. Algorithms divide populations with surgical precision, isolating them into digital tribes that war endlessly, never realizing they share the same master. Every rebellion now is a loop, absorbed back into the machine. Rage becomes a trend. Dissent becomes entertainment. You're allowed to scream, so long as your echo feeds their metrics. This is the new form of blood control. Not genetic, not physical, but behavioral inheritance. They track the collective psyche, predict its fluctuations, and guide it toward outcomes that preserve hierarchy. Think of it as selective breeding for the mind. The system doesn't need to kill ideas. It drowns them in noise. It doesn't need to burn books. It buries truth beneath infinite versions of it. And those who design this lattice of illusion, they carry the same obsession that haunted Edmund Routledge: permanence. To shape not just one generation, but every generation that follows. Through stories, screens, and systems that outlive their creators, you've been trained to call this progress, to mistake control for safety, to equate comfort with truth. But ask yourself, why does every act of freedom lead you back into dependency? Why does every escape route end in another algorithmic wall? Because the plantation was never dismantled. It was digitized. And now you feed it willingly. With your data, your time, your attention, your silence. When you follow the lineage of control far enough back, you find that it was never a collection of random rulers or conspiracies. It was a system of inheritance. Power itself was bred, passed like sacred scripture through families who understood that domination must be preserved through secrecy. From ancient priesthoods in Babylon to the merchant dynasties of Venice, from the crowned aristocracies of Europe to the corporate empires of America. The same pattern repeats: blood, belief, control. They call themselves different names across centuries: orders, councils, foundations. But they all serve the same principle: preserve the hierarchy by any means necessary. Their allegiance isn't to nations or gods, but to continuity. They know that empires fall, technologies evolve, religions fade, but systems endure when encoded into structure. The blueprint of control, once carved into stone, now exists in digital code and corporate charters. They are not men in dark robes gathered under torchlight. They are the faces you see on philanthropic boards, academic chairs, investment summits. They do not hide because they don't need to. Their secrecy is psychological, built on the assumption that no one will believe what's too vast to be seen. The plantation became the economy, the overseer became the brand, the sermon became the algorithm. They move capital across continents, funding wars and peace alike. They shape education to produce obedience disguised as ambition. They direct research not toward liberation, but toward refinement of control. And they have always understood one law of power that Edmund Routledge practiced in miniature: control the source, and the generations follow. If you look at the modern institutions that shape your mind, the media conglomerates, the banks, the universities, the think tanks, trace their origins. You'll find the same surnames, the same bloodlines. The old plantation simply changed form, acquiring patents and patents replacing slaves. They learned to manage humanity as an ecosystem, not a population, to breed loyalty without awareness, to harvest consent disguised as convenience, and those who try to expose it are not silenced by violence. They are drowned by irrelevance, their warnings labeled theories, their truths filtered into fiction, because the deepest form of secrecy is not hiding, it's normalization. When everyone accepts the invisible structure as reality, the need for chains disappears. There comes a moment when a man begins to see the pattern, not as theory, not as story, but as reflection. He notices how every system that claims to free him subtly binds him tighter. How the jobs that promise purpose drain his energy. How the entertainment that promises escape keeps him docile. How the politics that promise change always preserve the same hierarchy. That's when something ancient inside him stirs. The same spark that drove slaves to flee, dissidents to write, and prophets to defy kings. Awareness is the first act of rebellion. It begins small, a question he can't unask, a headline that feels staged, a memory that doesn't fit the script. And once that crack appears, light pours through. He begins to recognize that history isn't linear. It's recursive, looping back through the same machinery with new names. The plantation, the empire, the corporation, the cloud, all versions of the same architecture of ownership. The awakening hurts. Every comfort begins to rot in his hands. He feels the weight of lies, the depth of his conditioning. He realizes that he's been raised to obey disguised as virtue, taught to doubt his instincts, to outsource truth, to kneel before credentials instead of wisdom. He sees that fear is the leash, and distraction the cage. And beneath that realization, an older knowledge whispers you were never meant to serve. That's when the system tests him. It offers rewards for silence, labels for dissent, comfort for surrender. The overseer's voice becomes internal. Don't ask that. Don't look there. Stay safe. But safety was always the trap. The man who sees the pattern begins to withdraw his energy from the illusion. He stops feeding the algorithm, stops kneeling to spectacle. He learns that every act of attention is a vote of power. He begins to rebuild his inner architecture: discipline, clarity, sovereignty. Slowly, he reclaims what was stolen, his will. And here's the truth most never reach. The plantation cannot exist without participation. The overseer fades the moment you stop responding. The machine collapses when you stop believing. So the awakening is not about escaping the system. It's about collapsing it within yourself. When the veil finally lifts, the man realizes that the system he fought was never entirely outside him. It lived within. Every fear, every hesitation, every reflex to obey was part of the architecture. The plantation didn't just shape the world, it shaped the mind. To destroy it, he would have to dismantle the version of himself that had been built to survive within it. This is the forbidden act, not violence, not revolt, but inner disobedience. The decision to no longer feed the false gods of control, approval, status, comfort. He understands that true rebellion is not loud. It's silent, disciplined, invisible. It's the art of withdrawal. The moment he stops believing that he is powerless, the entire design fractures. He begins by observing his thoughts like a warden watching prisoners. Which impulses are his, and which were planted? Which desires serve truth, and which serve control? The answers come slowly, painfully. He discovers that his habits are chains, his distractions are sedatives, and his comfort is captivity. But through that awareness, the cage begins to lose its shape. The overseers can't control what they can't predict, and a man who no longer reacts becomes unpredictable. That's the first freedom. The second is creation. He rebuilds his life not on consumption but on craft, thought, movement, purpose. He cultivates attention as a weapon. He speaks little but listens deeply. He learns that mastery is not dominance but understanding. The mentor's final lesson is this: the world doesn't need more outrage. It needs consciousness. The plantation cannot exist in the presence of the awake. He realizes the inheritance he was meant to claim isn't blood or status. It's sovereignty. The same power that was hoarded by empires and bloodlines lies dormant in every mind that dares to see. The forbidden descent was never about falling into darkness. It was about descending into truth. And so the man steps out of the structure quietly. No announcement, no revolution, just a shift from obedience to awareness. The machine keeps running, but one cog has vanished from its rhythm. That's how collapse begins. not with a bang, but with a silence that spreads. Because once enough men awaken, the plantation loses its workers, and without workers, even gods starve.